Something feels off. You can sense it deep within your soul, even if you can't quite explain it. The world around you is sinking into darkness, a place where sin isn't just accepted, but celebrated. Many claim to be Christians, yet live as if God doesn't exist. Churches preach about love, blessings, and prosperity, but remain silent on the most vital truth, the real power in spiritual life. And what's even more alarming, a crucial Bible verse has been quietly removed from many modern translations, a direct statement from Jesus himself, not just a suggestion, but a sacred secret to overcoming the forces of darkness. Matthew 17:21, "This kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." Why was this verse taken out? Why don't modern churches teach this anymore? The answer is clear. Because it reveals a truth the enemy doesn't want you to know, that spiritual battles aren't won through words alone, but through surrender, discipline, and true sacrifice. Today, you're about to uncover a truth that's been hidden for far too long, and once you know it, there's no going back. There's a deeper reason why that verse was removed from many modern Bible translations. Not merely due to manuscript issues, but because it challenges the comfortable gospel this generation has unknowingly embraced. A convenient faith, a faith that demands nothing, a faith without sacrifice, without discipline, without surrender. A sugar-coated version of belief, designed not to offend, never to confront the deeper corners of the soul. We're living in a time where truth is seen as too heavy, too harsh, too hard to hear. Churches no longer want to preach messages that cause people to examine themselves. They choose softness, encouragement, gentle advice, while avoiding the piercing warning spoken directly from the mouth of Christ. And in that avoidance, a critical truth has been lost. Spiritual life cannot exist without sacrifice. Matthew 17:21 is not just a verse, it's a spiritual principle, a divine code. A key that unlocks a depth of faith few have ever touched. It reveals the reality that not every problem in life can be solved with prayer alone. There are forces, spiritual chains, soul-level bondages that cannot be broken without the combination of prayer and fasting, the two most powerful weapons of a devout believer. And this is exactly why the verse becomes inconvenient in modern theology, where discipline is seen as extreme, fasting is labeled outdated, and surrender is replaced with the mantra, "Just believe," and "That's enough." But think deeply. How can a faith that requires no sacrifice ever bring transformation? How can a person become new without letting go of the old? How can we stand in the face of spiritual battles without being trained in sacrifice and humility? No one can truly enter into the power of God while staying inside the comfort zone. The truth is, authentic faith always demands letting go. Letting go of self, of flesh, of anything that distances us from the Holy Spirit. Prayer is connection. Fasting is surrender. And when these two work together, they open the gateway to true deliverance and deep restoration. Yet today, most believers no longer hear these teachings. They are fed a gospel of convenience, where everything is easy, where the call to the cross is watered down, where dedication is replaced by fleeting emotion. When you remove Matthew 17:21, you're not just erasing a sentence, you're erasing a spiritual foundation. You're weakening the very message of Jesus, who never hid the fact that his path is narrow, difficult, steep, but also the only path that leads to life. Look at the heroes of faith throughout Scripture, from Moses, Daniel, Elijah to Jesus himself. None of them lived easy, comfortable, peaceful lives. All of them walked through deep sacrifice, spiritual solitude, and fire-tested discipline, and it was that which unlocked heavenly power. So why do we now believe we can live a Christian life without warfare, without sacrifice, without deep prayer, without fasting and spiritual discipline? When that verse was cast aside, a fog settled over the minds of millions of believers, making them forget that faith isn't just a fleeting feeling, but a journey that demands full surrender. Faith is not a confession on the lips. It's a life of self-denial, daily cross-bearing, and walking under the guidance of the Spirit, and it is in that surrender that the deepest connection to heaven is born. Matthew 17:21 is a wake-up call for this generation, a call to return to what is pure and powerful in the life of faith, a reminder that if you truly want to see change, if you want to break spiritual chains, restore your family, heal your heart, and step into the calling God has placed on your life, then surface-level faith won't be enough. You must be willing to go deeper, willing to pray relentlessly, willing to fast in quiet but powerful surrender, willing to say no to the flesh and yes to holiness, because holiness is not optional. It's the evidence of true salvation. We were never called to live comfortably. We were called to live transformed, sanctified, and set apart for God. If you've read this far, pause and ask yourself, am I truly living in surrender or just carrying an empty form of religion? Let the verse that was once removed awaken you. Let the words of Jesus ignite in you a faith that not only believes, but surrenders. As you stand on the threshold of this truth, let your soul grow still and feel the holy wind stirring in the hidden corners of your heart. Something was lost, not by accident, but by a subtle design. Think about it: prayer and fasting, the very pillars that upheld the faith of spiritual warriors throughout history, from Moses on Mount Sinai to Daniel in the lion's den to Jesus in the wilderness, have now been cast aside, buried in dust, removed from the pulpit. Why? Because silence has crept into the center of Christian life. Not accidental silence, but intentional, concealing the power God gave us to face the forces of darkness. Pastors and shepherds often hesitate to speak of spiritual discipline. They fear that words like fasting or unceasing prayer sound too harsh, too outdated, maybe even too radical for a generation addicted to comfort and soft messages. They worry that this truth will drive people away, that it's not attractive enough to fill pews or keep modern believers who crave blessings but rarely embrace the cost required to enter into the depths of divine presence. But the Bible, God's living word, tells a very different story, a story that doesn't compromise, a story that doesn't avoid, a story ablaze with raw truth and unmatched power. Pause and look again at Matthew 17:21, a sentence spoken from the lips of Jesus, the one who walked among us, faced Satan and triumphed. He said, "This kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." This is not a vague suggestion or an optional tip. It is a serious warning, a clear map for those who desire a powerful spiritual life, one that rises above the traps of the world. But what happened to this verse? It was quietly removed from many modern translations, versions like NIV or ESV, used by millions of believers every day. The reason scholars give sounds simple, yet it's deeply controversial. Some ancient manuscripts don't contain this verse, so they decided it may not be original. But ask yourself, was this removal truly harmless? Or is it part of a greater plan? A subtle effort to dim a truth the enemy fears you'll embrace. The result? Millions of Christians today live unaware that there are spiritual forces, unseen but powerful enemies, that can only be conquered through the divine union of deep prayer and sacrificial fasting. Imagine for a moment you're standing on a spiritual battlefield, surrounded by looming darkness, forces that seek to steal your peace, your joy, your purpose. You may shout out prayers, but without the surrender that comes through fasting, without denying yourself to step into God's presence, are you truly wielding the sword of the Spirit? Jesus didn't say this just to fill a page, he lived it. For 40 days in the wilderness, he fasted, prayed, and faced Satan's temptations, and came out with power that made demons tremble. He gave us that same key. But we've dropped it amidst the comforts of modern life, amidst sermons that talk about blessings but never mention the cost. This silence isn't just forgetfulness. It's theft. A deliberate effort to keep us weak, vulnerable, and disconnected from the true power God intended for His children. But this isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of an awakening. Think of the faith heroes of the past. Esther fasted and prayed to save her people from annihilation. The apostles in Acts lived lives of spiritual discipline to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. They didn't pursue comfort, they pursued God's presence. And in that sacrifice they found power that changed the world. You are called to walk that same path, not to live in meaningless hardship, but to enter into deeper communion with your Creator, where chains of darkness break, and God's light shines through you into the lives of others. This truth is not a burden, it's liberation. It's the fire that can burn away every barrier in your soul. Ask yourself, what would happen if you embraced this key? What would change if you stepped out of your comfort zone and offered not just prayers but your very life in surrender to God? Maybe you'd witness miracles you once thought only existed in the Bible. Maybe you'd become a lighthouse for souls lost in the dark. Matthew 17:21 is not just a forgotten verse, it's a call to action, a trumpet blast in the silence of this generation. Don't let it be buried any longer. Let it live in you, burn in you, and lead you into a Christian life marked not by a name, but by power. This journey is just beginning, and I invite you to walk it with me. Because once you discover this truth, you'll realize that God has been waiting to do greater things through you than you ever imagined. As the light of this teaching, the divine union of prayer and fasting, fades from the pages of modern Bibles, a great loss has silently occurred. It's not just a sentence that was erased, but an entire treasury of power stolen from the hands of God's people. Imagine a warrior stepping onto the battlefield, but his sharpest sword has been replaced with a feather. Beautiful, gentle, but utterly useless against the enemy. That is what's happening to millions of believers today. Instead of being equipped to stand firm in spiritual warfare, they are led into a soft, soothing version of faith, one with no fasting, no spiritual roar, no sweat of sacrifice. They're told to simply sit, feel comforted, sing a few hymns, and believe that's enough to overcome the growing darkness around them. But pause for a second and ask yourself, is a faith that demands nothing more than comfort really what Jesus lived and died to give us? The Bible, the living Word of God, never painted a picture of an easy or effortless spiritual life. Look at David, who faced Goliath not just with a stone, but with faith forged in lonely hours of prayer in the fields. Think of Elijah, who called fire down from heaven on Mount Carmel, not with empty words, but a life of discipline and total surrender to God's will. And above all, look to Jesus, who walked into the wilderness with a starving body after 40 days of fasting, and came out carrying power that made hell tremble. Spiritual victory is never a random gift falling from the sky. It is the reward of those willing to walk through fire, to deny themselves, and reach for the strength of the Almighty. But when Matthew 17:21 is removed from sight, when the teaching of prayer and fasting is replaced by sermons focused only on convenience, we unknowingly lose the very key that unlocks supernatural victories. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a deep rushing river, its current strong enough to carry everything away. Across the river lies the Promised Land, where chains of fear, doubt, and failure are broken. But the bridge that leads you there isn't a smooth stone walkway. It's built from planks of discipline, ropes of unceasing prayer, and pillars of sacrificial fasting. The modern world tells you there's no need to cross. Just stay here, enjoy the view from afar, and believe God will bring the Promised Land to you. But Scripture cries out with another truth: contend earnestly for the faith. Jude 1:3. To contend isn't to sit still and wait. It's to rise, to take up spiritual weapons, and to walk boldly with courage forged in surrender. When this teaching disappears, we don't just lose a tool. We lose the very essence of the battle we were called to win. But don't let this realization bring you despair. Let it ignite a fire within you. This truth is not gone forever. It's simply waiting to be awakened. Look through history. In the darkest hours, when the church drifted into compromise, there were always those who rose up, reclaimed forgotten truths, and shook the world. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, lived with fasting and prayer as the very breath of his soul, and through that he sparked a revival that swept across continents. The early believers in Acts turned the world upside down not through wealth or worldly influence, but through fierce spiritual lives, ready to give up everything for the presence of God. You are invited into that same legacy, not to live a mediocre life, but to become the wind that drives back darkness, carrying the light of eternal truth. Now imagine what would happen if you dared to live differently today. What would change if you fasted for a day? Not to prove anything, but to hear God's voice more clearly? What if your prayers weren't just whispered moments, but deep conversations where you poured your fears and burdens into His hands? That's not extremism. That's returning to the roots of faith, where real power is found. When this teaching is hidden, the enemy wants you to believe you're weak, that the battles are too big to overcome. But the truth is, you were born to fight, equipped to stand, and called to shine in the midst of darkness. Let this sink deep into your soul. Spiritual victory doesn't come from comfort, it comes from surrender. Not surrender to the enemy, but to the Lord of Heaven's armies. When you embrace this truth, you're not just reclaiming a tool, you're reclaiming your destiny. Don't let the silence of this generation cause you to shrink back. Rise up, cross the bridge of sacrifice, and discover that on the other side, God is waiting to give you more than you could ever imagine. This journey does not end here, it's just beginning, and I invite you to continue with me so that together we may live lives not merely of words, but of true power from God. Pause for a moment and feel the weight of what's been lost. Not just a few lines erased from an old page, but a vast ocean of spiritual depth drained away, leaving us standing on the dry sands of shallow faith. This trade-off is no small thing, it's monumental. So much so that it may send chills down your spine when you realize what has been stolen. When Matthew 17:21, "This kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting," was quietly removed, we didn't just lose a Bible verse. We lost a way of life, a way of being, a radiant path that Jesus Himself laid out to guide us through spiritual storms. This isn't about a few forgotten words. This is the theft of a sacred inheritance, a way of life, known by those who understood that victory doesn't belong to the ones who seek ease, but to those who are willing to kneel in surrender, stand in discipline, and walk with unwavering faith that God works through their sacrifice. Imagine standing before an ancient door, etched with eternal truth. Behind it lies a room flooded with light, where the secrets of spiritual life are revealed, where power to face darkness is within your grasp. But someone has locked that door, thrown away the key, and told you it's not necessary to enter, that standing on the porch, admiring the light from afar, is good enough. That's what happens when this teaching is erased. We are stripped of the right to enter the depths of God's presence, where prayer is no longer a whispered routine, but the roar of a soul longing for deliverance, where fasting is not just skipping meals, but a holy act of surrender, offering the body as a living sacrifice to invite divine power. This is more than the loss of a verse, it's the loss of the essence of Christian living, a life that doesn't avoid hardship, but embraces it like fire refining gold. Look back to the early days, when believers didn't gather in comfortable buildings with bright lights and soft music. They were faith warriors, wandering deserts, hiding in caves, standing in open squares before lions and flames. Men like Paul, who wrote his greatest letters not from luxury but from prison, strengthened by constant prayer and voluntary fasting. Think of Anna the prophetess in Luke 2, who spent her life in the temple, worshiping God with fasting and prayer night and day. They weren't chasing a feel-good faith, they lived a reality where victory only came through total surrender to God's will. Now compare that to our generation, a time where faith is often reduced to short slogans, 15-minute sermons, and promises of blessing that require nothing but a raised hand. This trade-off isn't just tragic, it's a gaping chasm between what we could become and what we're settling for. But let me tell you a different story. The story of a small seed. When planted, it doesn't demand comfort. It allows itself to be buried, to be covered in darkness. And from that sacrifice, a mighty tree grows, its branches spreading shade across the field. Matthew 17:21 is that seed in our spiritual lives. When it is removed, we don't just lose a teaching, we lose the opportunity to grow into spiritual giants, rooted deep in discipline, reaching toward heaven through prayer. The truth is, spiritual victory is never handed to us on a silver platter. It is the fruit of a soul willing to endure the cold winds of fasting, to kneel in the shadows of prayer, and rise with the light of God blazing in the heart. This loss is too great because it doesn't just erase a sentence, it robs us of the potential to live as warriors, prophets, world changers, empowered by God. Ask yourself, what kind of life do you want to live? A quiet life in the safety zone, where spiritual battles are dismissed like passing winds? Or a blazing life, where you step into the arena with the torch of prayer and the sword of fasting, ready to face any darkness? This loss doesn't have to be accepted as fate. It's a wake-up call, a voice from deep within your soul, urging you to reclaim what has been stolen. Imagine what would happen if you chose to live the way Jesus showed us. Not in fear, but in freedom. Not in weakness, but in power. Maybe you'll see doors long closed burst open, chains fall off, and a new strength rise within you, strong enough to make heaven rejoice. Yes, this loss is great, but the return can be even greater. And it starts right now, with you. Picture yourself walking a fog-covered path, surrounded by soft whispers, promises of an easy life with no pain, no challenge. But as you listen closely, you realize something is missing. There is no echo of passionate prayer, no warmth of sacrificial fasting, no footsteps of spiritual warriors rising to confront the darkness. If you've grown up in a world where sermons rarely speak of the power of prayer and fasting, if no one has ever told you that fighting invisible forces requires denying yourself, then stop and ask, what is guiding you? A gentle gospel wrapped in the sweet coating of comfort may be calling your name, but that's not the true gospel that Jesus lived, died, and rose again to give you. That is a faded shadow, a passing breeze, not strong enough to blow away the dark clouds gathering over your soul. Picture this. You're standing at the base of a towering mountain, its peak hidden in clouds. The radiant glory of God's presence waiting at the summit. The path upward is not a smooth paved trail, but a steep, rugged climb. You must grip the rocks with bare hands, kneel at times to find footing through prayer, and leave behind the burdens of comfort through fasting. But what if no one ever told you this path exists? What if you were only taught to stand at the foot of the mountain, look up, smile, and believe that's enough? Then, you've been misled by a version of faith with no spine, no fire, no strength to carry you through the valleys of life. The true gospel was never a lullaby, it is a battle cry, a blazing fire, a call to step into a life where victory is claimed through sweat, tears, and unshakable trust in the one who went before you. Let's go back in time, to the early days of the church. Believers didn't sit in cozy rooms with warm coffee in hand. They gathered in cold caves, praying until their voices cracked, fasting until their bodies trembled, and walked out with power that shook the Roman Empire. Think of Peter and John, standing before the crippled man at the beautiful gate, saying, "Silver and gold I have none, but what I do have I give to you." Acts 3:6. What they had wasn't earthly wealth. It was spiritual power forged in a life of surrender. Or remember Jesus himself, who spent nights on the mountains praying to the Father and days in the wilderness, fasting, facing the greatest enemy of mankind. The gospel he preached was not a recliner of comfort, it was a narrow, rugged road filled with power and purpose. So what has happened to us today? Why has the voice of prayer and fasting been silenced, replaced with comforting phrases, feel-good sermons that soothe but don't transform? It's because we've been drawn into an illusion. A feel-good gospel designed to keep you passive, unchallenged, and quiet, but also powerless when life's storms come. It's like floating on a fragile raft in a raging ocean. It might keep you afloat for a while, but when the real waves hit, it breaks apart, leaving you stranded. The true gospel is not that raft. It is a mighty ship, built from the wood of the cross, sails filled with the wind of the Spirit, and steered by the rudder of spiritual discipline, ready to carry you through any storm into the harbor of God's will. Let me draw you another picture. You're standing in a thick forest, sunlight barely breaking through the canopy, and around you echo the whispers of unseen creatures lurking. In your hand is a torch, but it won't burn with ordinary fuel. It needs the oil of prayer and the wood of fasting to blaze. If no one teaches you how to light it, if no one tells you this torch is your weapon to drive out the darkness, then you'll stay lost, imprisoned by fears you were never meant to carry. That's the tragedy of a generation that no longer hears about the power of spiritual sacrifice. Stuck in a forest they were never meant to remain in, simply because no one handed them the torch that God had already ordained for them to carry. But don't let this discourage you. Let it ignite a fire within you. Truth has not disappeared, it's just waiting to be rediscovered. Think of the moments in history when people dared to break the silence of their generation. George Mueller, who fed thousands of orphans, not with wealth, but through unceasing prayer and fasting. Or the Moravian missionaries, who sold themselves into slavery to bring the gospel to distant lands, living on the strength of their fierce spiritual devotion. They didn't settle for an easy gospel. They lived the true gospel, and through it they shook the world. You too are called into that legacy, not to live a forgettable life, but to be a wind of the Spirit, breathing life into barren places. Ask yourself, what would change if you stepped off the easy path? If you gave 1 hour to heartfelt prayer, 1 day to fasting with your whole soul, what might happen? Maybe you'd discover a strength you never knew you had. Maybe walls would crumble, doors would open, and a new light would illuminate your path. The easy gospel may comfort you for a moment, but the true gospel will transform you into a warrior, a light bearer, a survivor of every shadow. Sacrifice is not a burden. It is the doorway to true freedom. So what will you choose? To keep listening to the lullaby of a gospel that demands nothing, or to rise, ignite your torch, and walk the path Jesus paved before you? I believe something deep inside you is stirring. A voice calling you to the true gospel, inviting you to live a life that doesn't just survive, but overcomes. Take hold of it, because when you do, you'll discover that you were never meant to be led by ease. You were born to shine in the power of God. Let a simple yet piercing question cut through the fog of your mind like a sword. Are you truly ready to live by the truth? Not a half-truth, not a sugar-coated truth, but the raw, blazing truth that demands everything from you? Or will you continue walking the familiar path of a soft, gentle faith, where there are no storms of trials, no fire of sacrifice, and therefore no power to lift you out of life's darkest valleys? Matthew 17:21. This kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting is not just a forgotten verse. It's a trumpet echoing from the mountaintop of sacred truth, shaking the foundations of a generation lulled by comfort, forgetting that true victory never comes from ease. It is a wake-up call, a lighthouse in the storm, beckoning you back to a life not of mere words, but of living power from the Spirit of God. Imagine yourself standing on a vast plateau, the wind brushing through your hair, carrying the scent of a distant realm, a place where brave souls once walked before you. Ahead lie 2 paths, one smooth and paved, shaded by leafy trees, promising a journey without pain or fatigue, the other rugged and steep, strewn with jagged stones and thorny thickets. But at the end of that difficult path, the radiant light of God's presence awaits. The easy path is tempting, but it only circles the base of the mountain. It never leads to the summit. The harder path is daunting, but it promises a reward beyond imagination, a life where you don't just exist, you live fully, where you don't just witness miracles, you become one. Matthew 17:21 is the map that leads to this second path. whispering to you that the greatest battles with the darkness inside and around you can only be won when you dare to surrender, dare to fast, and dare to pray with all your heart. Look back at the golden pages of faith's history, where ordinary people did extraordinary things simply because they chose to live by this truth. Think of Daniel, who knelt 3 times a day in a hostile kingdom, unafraid of lions, because he knew prayer was the breath of his soul. Remember Esther, who called her people to fast and pray before she walked into the palace, facing death, but saving a nation through her surrender. And above all, look to Jesus, who spent 40 days in the wilderness, turning away every temptation of comfort, and came out carrying a power that made both nature and demons bow. They didn't choose a gentle faith. They chose a fierce one, forged in the fire of sacrifice, leaving an eternal imprint on the world. But today, where do we stand? A generation rocked to sleep by sweet promises, convinced we can win without fighting, climb without sweat. Let me paint a vivid picture for you. You're standing at the edge of a raging river, the current sweeping away everything in its path. Across the river lies a vibrant field, the place of your dreams, your destiny, the promises of God. But there is no smooth bridge, no comfortable boat. To cross, you must step into the freezing waters, let it wash away the remnants of compromise, strip off everything unnecessary. Prayer is your hands reaching toward heaven. Fasting is your feet pushing through the current. Surrender is your heart believing God will keep you from drowning. Matthew 17:21 is the voice calling from the other side, reminding you that there are no shortcuts to victory. Only the road of sacrifice leads you to where you truly belong. This truth is not easy to accept, but that's where its beauty lies. It doesn't lull you with pleasant lies. It challenges you to stand, look in the mirror, and ask, who do I truly want to become? Someone content with the crumbs of comfort, or someone who dares to reach for the banquet table of God's power? This generation may have forgotten, but you don't have to. You can be the wake-up call in the silence, the flame in the ashes, the living testimony that God still moves through those who dare to live by His word. True surrender is not weakness. It is the highest strength, the key that opens doors no man can shut. Think about this. What if you chose to live by the truth of Matthew 17:21? What if you gave a day to fasting, not out of duty, but out of longing to hear God's voice? What if you prayed not just to receive blessings, but to stand in His presence? What might happen? Maybe you'd feel a new wind stirring your soul, a fresh fire rising in your bones. Maybe the chains of fear, doubt, and defeat would shatter before your eyes. This isn't a question of ability, it's a question of willingness. God doesn't seek perfect people, He seeks willing hearts. Those who dare to say, I'll take the harder path, because I believe He's worth it. So what will you choose? To hold on to a powerless faith, beautiful but fragile like a soap bubble, or to step into a life where every step is a declaration, every breath is a prayer, and every sacrifice is a victory? Matthew 17:21 is not just a warning for a generation, it is a personal invitation to you right now. Let its sound echo in your heart, awakening you from the sleep of comfort. You were not born to live small. You were born to live greatly, not by your strength, but by the power of the one who called you out of the darkness. Be ready, because when you say yes to this truth, all of heaven stands behind you, and no darkness can stand in your way.